Yeah, good day everyone, and thank you very much to the IPA for giving John Roscombe in particular for giving me the opportunity to speak about a topic which I guess everyone in Melbourne in particular and in Australia is very dear to everyone. I guess I was asked to talk about sport in the context of Western civilisation and then of course connect it to Australia. And my first thought of course was I guess the origins of sport and Western civilisation are roughly around the same time when you consider the Greeks, the ancient Greeks and the Olympic Games. And then of course with the Romans we had chariot racing and gladiators. And if you're wondering what gladiators were like in their day, I guess the best way, if you have Foxtel, you can see something called Ultimate Fighting, and or UC as an American journalist friend of who has strongly recommended that I watch this. In Ultimate Fighting, essentially, what you're allowed to do is anything. So you can have a submission holds expert, which is someone who can basically squeeze you until you die, up against a kickboxer. So it makes quite interesting TV. But I guess that's how sport works. It starts. That's probably a revival of antiquity that is probably less celebrated than other renaissances we've seen. Probably one of the things that I find most striking about sport and global sport, and in the context of Australia, is the British heritage. And I suppose the British, of all the peoples in the world, have had a particular genius, not for playing sport, not recently, but more for, and not even necessarily for inventing sports. If you look at these sports, I'll just give you the list: golf, tennis, soccer, or you've got to be careful calling it soccer. If you call it soccer these days, you can get into a lot of trouble. They like to call it football. It is, of course, it is football. Cricket, of course, and then we have, I would include somewhat baseball and basketball, and of course boxing, which of course I would regard as the world's oldest sport. And I guess it occupies a similar place in terms of respectability in many people's minds to the world's oldest profession. So, but having said that, like the world's oldest profession, boxing in some form will always be with us, which I guess is why boxing has died and Ultimate Fighting on Foxtel. If you do have it, it's on Fuel TV. Not that I watch it that often. So just onto the British heritage. What the British have done in sport is quite astonishing when you consider that all of those sports that I've mentioned, the biggest sports in the world, the most popular sports, were pretty much codified by the Brits. So golf, of course, came out of Scotland, and it's not, and you look at soccer and golf, to take two examples, it's not exactly original, the idea of kicking a ball along the ground, and nor is the idea of hitting something with a stick along the ground and seeing if you can, progress it further down a field. However, what the Brits have done in all these games, rugby, sorry, was one I missed, is that they imposed law and order upon those sports. So all of these sports may have sprung up. I think soccer, there's some evidence that the Chinese got there first in, I think, about the 2nd or 3rd century BC. However, we don't have soccer as we currently understand it until 1863, when the Football Association set down the rules for the game. Many of these sports, interestingly enough, were codified, the rules were established in the 19th century, which is obviously a formative period for all manner of things in Western civilisation. So the English have come with these sports and they've set down the rules, and I would consider it in a way one of their great and underrated gifts to the West and indeed to the world. And I think in the context of Australia, just come to Australia in a second. So what we had is the, just on golf, I suppose the golf has a commandment. It's not simply that it has rules. Golf is a sport that relies heavily on etiquette because which governs the way people play. And in golf, the commandment is thou shalt play the ball where it lies. And the other one, of course, is not to interfere with the ball in any way, which is called cheating. And I would regard that you could, in a golf sense, lay the ball where it lies is tantamount to love thy neighbour as thyself in Christianity. It's pretty much the fundamental tenet of the faith. So if you go to, we come to Australia, and I think what's come out of, we of course are a society grafted from a British Anglo heritage and then have become multicultural, and what occurred with Australia was we pretty much inherited all the British games, which are the global games. Cricket became our major summer sport. We then got tennis, we got golf, and we got the rugby codes, rugby league and rugby union. Interestingly enough, the split between rugby league and rugby union occurred pretty much simultaneously in Britain and in Australia, and it was a split about professionalism. So it was rugby league essentially was a more working class game, and as in cricket, where there was a division between professionals and amateurs, rugby league became the professional game played by the working class. And we see that split to this day in Australia, where rugby union has still got a bit of a private school basis, whereas rugby league is, its heartland, where the AFL is now fighting it, is in the western suburbs of Sydney and, of course, in Queensland. So what happened, curiously enough, in Australia is that amid these British games that were the mainstay, a local game sprung up somewhat unexpectedly, which is, of course, Australian football, and which, I don't know if you've noticed this, but more recently it's increasingly been known as AFL. So the actual name of the sport more and more is being called AFL, even though the actual name is Australian rules football or Australian football. And that, I guess that's an instance, it says something about the brand potency of that competition when the sport becomes the name. It's a bit like Hoover or Google, where the brand becomes it. And what we've seen in Australia was we took these British games, and then we had Australian football, which initially, of course, was set up as a sport for cricketers to keep fit in winter, as the likes of Geoffrey Blaney and others have written about. It was, I think that give them a game of their own. I think might have been Tom Wills. He was a great eccentric who is the co-inventor of what we call, I guess is increasingly known as AFL. So, which sprung up in Victoria principally. At one point, it was called Victorian rules, and one of the reasons for its strength, I would suppose, and it's a fairly obvious point, is that split between the rugby codes in New South Wales and Queensland, which split along class lines. One of the great strengths of Australian football was that it was pretty much classless. So you had the founders at the first game ever played between Melbourne Grammar and Scotch, and yet as this sport took root in the inner suburbs of Melbourne, you had these clubs like Richmond and Collingwood and Carlton from these working class areas which followed the game with great fanaticism, and yet at the same time you had a club like the Melbourne Football Club, which was very much an extension of, I suppose, the Melbourne Club in a way. That the fact that competition and that sport could embrace those different classes, I think was one of the bases for its massive strength. I think one of the other interesting and distinctively Australian features of it was that it was played on such a vast space. And in Australia, I think we take notions of space, and having an enormous amount of space are very, intrinsic to the way we live. Australian football couldn't be played in a lot of societies. I mean, I think some of the AFL's evangelical desire to spread the code to, the Ukraine or wherever. I think at one point Kevin Sheedy claimed that the Ukraine don't have a national sport, so why don't they just take up AFL? Well, I don't think that's too likely, Kevin. But in any case, the AFL, what I suppose happened between the codes was that for about maybe 100 years, close to 100 years, below Wagga, I think it was Professor Ian Turner, John Hurst would probably know this, Professor Ian Turner, I think, spoke of the Barassi line, and everything below the Murrumbidgee and Wagga was pretty much Australian football, and everything above it was one or both of the rugby codes. For a long time, I would see those codes existing in much the same way that almost collusively, like Amcor and Visi. And there was a no competition pact. And then in end of 1981, the then VFL made the quite brave, some would say reckless decision to shift South Melbourne to Sydney. And thereafter what we've seen the best way to probably understand it is to look at the AFL as an imperial power that is seeking to take over these other territories and bankrolled pretty much by people, the likes of Joffa and the Collingwood cheer squad and the fanatically followed game down here has enabled them, has given them this enormous revenue base, increasingly now through television. You'll see that the television rights are now up well over $1 billion, and that's given them a war chest to quite aggressively invade the northern states and try and basically take over. The rugby codes, unsurprisingly, are resisting this, as they should, and we now have a rugby union team in Melbourne called the Rebels, and we also have the Storm, I guess we're now in what I think will be looked back upon in future years as quite an historic period in which we're really living through the most extraordinary competition between sporting codes that we've ever seen. And incidentally, one that you wouldn't see anywhere else in the world. It doesn't happen. In England, there is rugby and there is rugby league, but there is not the sort of competition that you see between the football codes here. And in America, of course, soccer is a minnow, much, probably in relative terms, smaller than it is here. They have their own game, American football. I've never been fully appreciative of why it's called football, because I think they put foot to ball about 4 or 5 times a game. So, but of course, the other thing we love about the American competitions is that if you're the champion of American football or the champion of baseball, then you're the champion of the world, which tells you something about Americans, and I guess, in terms of how they see their place in the world in terms of sport. So I guess one of the more interesting points to this audience about where we've ended up with the AFL in competition with these other sports is that the AFL has another distinguishing feature is that it's an extraordinarily regulated competition. Talking to Cameron Schwab recently, the CEO of Melbourne, he made the point, he's been overseas quite a bit, studied it quite closely, that the AFL is the most regulated major sporting competition in the world. They have a draft and a salary cap and a series of mechanisms to ensure that the weak clubs aren't too weak and that the strong clubs aren't too strong. And it's also fascinating to me that one of the principal architects of that system was Graham Samuel. Of course, head of, until tomorrow or next week or whenever it is, head of the ACCC. But, Samuel, along with Ross Oakley, were the main driving forces behind the national competition and behind a very tight regulatory regime, which, is always in flux. There is always a flux in that competition between allowing the strong clubs to assert their dominance. And right at this moment, I think if you look at the ladder and you look at Geelong, who've become a very financially strong club, Collingwood, the West Coast Eagles are up there, Carlton are coming back as a classic sort of rapacious 80s type institution. So we're going through a period now where I think the financially strong clubs are reasserting some sense of dominance. So I guess one way that we in Australia should start to think of our, we don't tend to think of our sporting heritage as, I mean, the term lucky country is used many, many times and in many contexts. I think it applies to sport as much as to just about anything, because there are not many societies where we have not only people, the ordinary person has access to the elite levels of going to the sport at relatively, and I say relatively because it is rising, relatively affordable prices, but also where the ordinary Joe is able to actually recreationally play sport in a way that people in many other societies are not able to. It is a luxury to play golf in many, many countries. People simply do not have the space. In Melbourne, particularly, we're blessed with the sandbelt courses, which have allowed people to play a sport that in many places is just simply too expensive, too hard to get on for, and too elite. I guess just on another, I guess, final point on sport. I've always been of the belief that sport in Australia and everywhere often anticipates changes in a society. You'll often see changes happening, social change included, happening in sport about a decade or more before it happens in the broader body politic. For instance, I think it was the late 40s. It was the late 40s. A fellow called Jackie Robinson became the first African American to be allowed to play in the major leagues. That was almost a decade before the case called Brown versus the Board of Education, which led to desegregation of American schools. Similarly, you could mount a case that the celebrity of Tiger Woods and his rise as a golfer predated Barack Obama by about a decade. So that, in a sense, what sport sometimes does in the West is conditions people to new social norms before the rest of society has caught up with them. And I think, to a degree, that happened in Australia. I always felt that of recent times, probably, people would say it was in the Howard years, but I think it was probably predates that actually, that there was a new patriotism coming into Australia, which when I was growing up, I think we often looked upon the Americans as being a little bit ostentatious in their patriotism. But what I've noticed is that we always behaved more patriotically about what happened on a sporting ground than we did in other spheres of life. However, I think what's happened is increasingly is that the sporting norms of supporting a country, of showing patriotism, of waving the flag, of even having a flag, that sporting type of norm has increasingly caught up with the rest of Australia. So I think I'll conclude on that note. Thank you.